briefly say, I wish I could arrange it so that I could have, I'm going to mess all of our video up right now, but so that I could have Marilyn Monroe freaking lifting weights in the background of my shot. Because that's one of my favorite pictures ever. I love it so much, but I can't get it in the shot.
That is pretty great. I mean, you could you could pull it down, right? Like you could pull it down so that it's behind where you're sitting. Like,
James, you're such a thinker.
Like
that's why it gets the big bucks.
25 minutes trying to like figure out how to like, but who knows?
You're right. I could have done that.
We got to see her.
Hi, Ryan.
Hi.
So we're gonna talk. Well, I there's a lot of stuff that we've been kind of rambling on about these last several dozen at this point podcasts that we've done, and a lot of it is focused on or centered around tradition, right? And like the way that we connect to tradition, sort of like the concept of tradition, right? So like the Hemaists have this sort of, we exist in this weird space where we don't have a way of grounding ourselves in terms of tradition, right? And so we have to figure out Sure, right. So I don't want to speak, like, it's not apparent or it's not very clear at the onset how you might set about doing that, right? And so the question that we've been asking each other and lots of other folks who've come to talk with us about it is like, how might we do that? What's the appropriate way to do that? What are the areas or what are the ways in which our community, historical fencing community, is like sort of oriented or primed to think about these things in particular ways? And I've gotten to really enjoy it. So Ryan, first we'll say, like, you get to introduce yourself, because you're a human with a
they found me on the street. I don't know what's going on. this is like a saw trap. I'm locked in here.
Right. So we'd like to hear a little bit about who you are, and then maybe get into the topic of and like particularly like not just who you are in terms of historical fencing or HEMA, but who you are in terms of tradition, and how you start to think about these types of things. And there's lots of stuff that we'll end up getting into, but we'll start with, like, where do you even live?
I currently live in South Florida, Fort Lauderdale specifically. I've lived in North Carolina almost all my life, though technically I was born in Florida, so I'm one of the weird native Floridians, and also the even weirder ones who returned. I lived in North Carolina most of my life. Mostly grew up in the mountains around there, then went to Charlotte for law school, and that's where I started HEMA for the first time under Eric Lowe back in 2016. So that's where I'm from and where I live. I'm bad at figuring out where to talk about myself here.
Sure. Okay. And so you went to law school. You finished law school?
I did.
Are you you're working in law right now in South Florida?
Well, thanks to the great legal job market collapse of when I graduated, I went into anti-money laundering, like many of us did, and that's actually what I work in now, is anti-money laundering investigation in the banking sector.
Right on. That's actually really interesting.
Not where it kind of came out of the blue, because in undergrad I was a philosophy and religion major, so people, it doesn't really necessarily. People don't think it connects, but I say I use my philosophy religion degree every day. They think I'm being pretentious, but I'm really not.
No, I know a lot of. I mean, definitely law, right? Like, so, like, religion, I think is probably not less intuitive, but certainly, like, as relates to law, philosophy is probably as fundamental as it gets, right? Like,
right.
Well, absolutely, philosophy, like, the ability to think, to use formal logic and things like that, to think deeper about problems in the preciseness of language. Religion, like, not in the theology sense, because I went to a secular religion program at a state university, is the academic study of religion as a phenomenon, which as a martial arts nerd, especially in HEMA spaces, comes in massive amounts of use, especially because people tend to not think of things as rituals or religions when they really are rituals and religions, and we don't want to call them that.
Absolutely.
Sure. Yeah.
All right, dude, you're a people man.
Yeah. Welcome. For
Yeah.
sure. So you started with Eric Lowe, and I got to meet Eric Lowe. I basically was in the same geography as him, but I didn't really get to hang out with him very much at all because of the nature of the event that we're at, or basically what I was up to at the event that we were at. But I did get to observe some of his class. He was teaching like a Bolognese polearms class. Is that so? What's as in terms of HEMA as such, right? Trademark. What is your practice?
My current main practice is the focus on Bolognese fencing, particularly the works of like the main earlier Bolognese authors, Dall'Agocchi, Morozzo, Mancellino. I've not had enough time to dive into the Anonimo like I would like because the Bolognese corpus is just huge, so it's hard to really give focus on. I started in German longsword. We were originally a German longsword and like general Kunst des Fechtens, RDL kind of school, but we've moved towards Bolognese because that's where Eric was leaning. That's where I really found my passion. Though I have a soft spot for that particular tradition. Again, from a religious studies standpoint and a textual standpoint, and the fact that I'm kind of a mystical weirdo of HEMA standpoint more than I sometimes like to let on. But that's and I also focus on the Escrima Común or vulgar destreza tradition of Domingo Godinho.
Nice.
Yeah. I'm watching you, Jesse. You're like ready to say something.
And like I admit to you that I dabble a little bit. I like to read everyone's book. Like this stuff is full of everything from like 19th century Italian saber and Savat and Cane all the way to like 133. Like I love reading everyone's book, doing workshops on everything. I love the whole thing. I just realize in one lifetime you can never really truly master it without coming into even your one system without and to go beyond it and try to master it all, you'll just kind of become a bit of a dilettante. And if that's what you want, you just want to eat the buffet, you don't want to really deep dive, that's fine. There's a space for you. It's just not where I'm currently at in my practice.
Yeah. Legit.
Okay. So, yeah. So, but you are interested in like what is on the buffet.
Oh yeah. 100%.
Right. Cause I see you referencing lots of stuff. I think the thing that I saw you comment about that really like endeared you to me was your love of professional wrestling and your background in professional wrestling or you know, like tell us about that.
Well, like
because you actually have like a legitimate background in professional wrestling, like maybe not
yes.
necessarily as a pro wrestler, but like having
well besides my great grandfather Bill Hutton, who was a wrestler in the legitimate sense. You see his name results in like YMCA championships and stuff. He also wrestled professionally and worked matches as well in like the 20s and 30s.
Nice.
And there's newspaper articles on it. There's some letters we have from him too that I want to eventually find a good museum for them to like sit in a collection for, like a Cauliflower Alley Club or professional wrestling museum. But it's always been in my blood. Even though I'm estranged from my father, he was an amateur wrestler in school. I grew up wrestling. I always was a big fan of pro wrestling. My grandfather, so my great grandfather's son, was a big like Wrasslin fan, as he pronounced it. He's from rural Ohio, and we would just watch it all the time. I wrestled amateur. I wrestled club Greco-Roman. And then I went to pro wrestling school. I went to Viper's House of Pain in Hendersonville, which is a short-lived, not very like, you know, outstanding glitzy pro wrestling school, but I liked the experience. I like theater. And I also have had the opportunity of studying some catch wrestling with Michael Allen, who has a living lineage to Billy Pops Wicks, who's a catch wrestler.
Yeah.
And I try whatever I can to make seminars for catch wrestling because it's just so rare nowadays. But it's in my blood, and I absolutely love professional wrestling, both worked and shoot. I've always loved it.
Nice.
How long were you like how long did you attend the what do you say Viper's Den?
Viper's House of Pain is the
Viper's
name
House
of
of Pain.
it. And again, it's very
Greatest
outlaw,
thing
very
about-
much very National Guard armory stuff here.
Yeah, but that's it, man. Like that's what I'm talking about. Like that's like I think that's so cool. Like we have this tradition. Like and like we spent all this time talking about like we're so homeless as a culture with regards to tradition and martial arts traditions and like these sort of living lineage and stuff that has a culture and ritual and ceremony and all of this stuff, right? And it's because my sort of pithy little rant about it is that it starts with like when pro wrestling turned into wrestling or sports entertainment, right? And then sports entertainment becomes kind of takes over, dominates the field. And then like pro wrestling as what it was in terms of like an expression of this sort of martial arts heritage and martial arts culture and tradition in the US collapses, right? So like as it existed up until that point, totally collapses. But like Viper's House of Pain, like that's exactly what you would read it, like what I would read about in like old pro wrestling books is like, or if you listen to like some of the guys that are retiring now or maybe retired 10-15 years ago, they talk about when they got introduced into like or brought into the business, right? Like that's where they ended up and basically they just got the crap kicked out of them for 3 months or however long it took for them to weed out everybody, and then it's like, okay, here's what we're really doing, kind of thing.
Yeah, and I've always been like a chubby dude with a broad torso built for wrestling essentially, and like running the ropes and getting stretched all the time is a miserable experience, particularly if you're, you got some weight on you and therefore you're not great at running. But what has traditionally always seen me through my poor cardio is my high tolerance for suffering. Like one of my main background outside of HEMA is Kyokushin Karate, which is also based on enduring. And that's always been my skill.
I went to y'all. I mean, this is a complete aside, but I did go last weekend before, to a local event that was a bunch of artists that created Totally Not Fake Wrestling was the name of the show.
Right.
And it was like an amateur take on pro wrestling, where every match also had a musical act associated with it and written for the match. It was pretty amazing. It was pretty great. Completely in a backyard, completely like, bring your own chairs sort of event. And I was there for it.
Right. Yeah, that's pretty funny what you can get away with now, right? So like it used to be like pro wrestling as a culture, like it used to be something that especially people who were quote unquote in the business like took very, very seriously, right? And there was this whole, there's this entire, like how you presented what you were doing and how you presented it when you were doing it, how you presented it outside of that, and how much care and responsibility you had to make sure that, and it wasn't like people knew, like obviously everyone knew that it wasn't exactly what it was being portrayed to be, or like I don't even know how do you even describe it, right? But like certainly this is in a pre WWE meta, right? So this is in like the territory days. Like everybody everyone understood that it was quote unquote fake, which isn't exactly right, even to say like even in those terms it's not exactly right. But exactly. But like but also people weren't like oblivious to you know what I mean. It's like people understood what was happening.
It's just also, clash too. You see this like among old guard people a lot, where like Jim Cornette's pretty prominent among them too. Like where he's like back in the day in the Southern Territories, people would try to kill you if you were a heel. Get like in addition to they would try to actually riot and murder you for cheating in these worked matches. It was just a different time. People would like if your character was a foreigner, you did not speak English. like
Right.
at all in public. Like heels and faces never ate dinner together, never any of that. And that's different now. And you know, Jim Cornette's very vociferous against that. And you know, it's difficult to say, you know, this old guard who wants this old thing that we can never really have back because the internet exists.
Exactly. Yeah. It wasn't.
Right.
Yeah. The internet is what broke it. It wasn't a Wrestling Observer, and it wasn't WWE or Vince McMahon or cable, or it was the internet. Right. The internet
Yeah.
is when everything collapsed, because you just have access to all the information. But yeah, that the whole idea of, well,
I was just gonna say you can back it up and just end it there. The internet is when everything collapsed. Period.
Yeah.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. So it's funny, but so getting back to your point, Jesse, about like the idea, like this, like you've got, like now wrestling, now you could just do like a musical act in the middle of your wrestling, and like that's not any more absurd from the product that we get today elsewhere. Right. And it's like where you can't even draw lines. Like there are no lines anymore.
Mm-hmm.
Well, in a weird way, it was kind of beautiful, right? Because it was random artists. Like they weren't stuntmen, they weren't professional wrestlers, they weren't real wrestlers. Like none of these people had any piece of that. But they were attempting to the limits of their abilities to like some of them climbed up on, like, number one, they built a ring. Like, and did a good job, right? And like climbed up on the ropes and leapt off the ropes near the other person, vaguely, right? Like, you know, so it gets weird.
It is. It does become more and more detached from ways in which what the expression of wrestling was, pro wrestling was, in, we'll say, the 20s and 30s. It's like, it was this contest. It was a sort of sporting contest, or, you know, a simulation or an approximation of a sporting contest that was, you know, rooted in this idea of like martiality, right? Or like combat, or whatever words that you want to use, like physical conflict, right? Like, you know, and so that's something I find interesting, because like we tend, or it's so easy for us now to think of martial arts as being like what you use for self-defense in the street, right? Like the idea behind martial arts is this thing that you do so that you can protect yourself when shit hits the fan or whatever, right? Which is not exactly right, or not even actually remotely right. And then like, but then like, so what these guys were doing back then was like as legit a martial practice as anything that we're doing right now, right? Like they learned to move, like all of the dimensions that you have to enhance your skills and abilities if you want to be a successful competitor in any sort of combat sport, or any martial expression, or any game for that matter, right? Like all of those dimensions, is particularly the way to use your body, the way to understand weight distribution, the way to time your actions, right? And coordinate your timing, the way to establish a connection with the opponent or the person that you're moving with and around, have that feel in, have that sensitivity, be able to respond by carefully coordinating the way that you move your body. Like all of those are dimensions that if I would have said that, if I would have packaged that, and without this previous conversation about wrestling, if I would have packaged what I just said and gave it to a historical fencer, they'd be like, yeah, I know exactly what you're talking about. You're talking about you're clearly talking about historical fencing. You're clearly talking about a real combat sport that's a real martial art that's used for killing in self-defense on the street when shit hits the fan, right? And of course I'm not, right? I'm talking about pro wrestling. And so go ahead.
100% on board, like with that. When I was like in my early 20s, a little over a decade ago, I was diehard like, no, I want what works in the street. Boxing, wrestling, Brazilian jiu-jitsu. That's it. The Muay Thai, that's the real martial arts. Everything else is fake. It's not real martial arts and stuff like that. I matured in some ways, and I learned more about what martial arts is. And it's not in sort of this Zen monk, oh, martial arts is really about the art of not fighting. It's not really that either. Like when somebody goes out and like does a demo that just looks sick, it is designed to recruit people for the school. that is also martial arts. People in the 19th century in China were doing this all the time. They're doing flashy demos to recruit students. That's what they did. Domingo Godinho, like I said, one of the masters I study, he's got, a bunch of stuff where you're like, you're making fake promises and apologies on your fingers, like I swear on the cross, and then jabbing your fingers in their eyes, all these dirty things. But he also has advice on, hey, when you're doing a demonstration, don't throw the same blow twice. It's just like advice like, hey, if you keep throwing the same attack, it don't look good.
Right.
Actually, yeah, that's a great point. One thing that I wanted to talk with you, Jesse, about was that when recently I got to watch, well, a few things. Have we talked about like demonstration and like fencing for a demonstration versus did I broach that subject with you at all?
It's new, baby. Bring it.
All right. Well, so we were talking about so a couple things. So I got to watch a friend of mine fence in the demos at WMAW, and it was just a radically new experience for him, and he had done swordsmanship, and he's a very, very competent fencer, but the experience of essentially performing, right?
Mm-hmm.
So it's unchoreographed, and there is a sort of it's a continuum, a shared continuum with more sporting or whatever versus more performance, but it was meant to be a display, right? And then we're talking about Damon Stith, he's been promoting African martial arts all over the country and in various events, and he was doing an event where he was teaching, and part of the tradition. And and this happened in North Carolina. I was just in North Carolina, Ryan, last weekend, I believe. And there was another person there who was teaching African martial arts, stick fighting, and it was the same deal. Everyone had their sticks, and there was a pair in the center of this circle made by the people, and they were clacking their sticks together and cheering. Right?
I live.
It was
for
just
that
this
stuff.
Well, and so what was really interesting to me, connecting all of this together, is just this idea that there are martial, traditions or sporting traditions, combat traditions that involve as a fundamental aspect of what it means to engage in this practice, right?
Mm-hmm.
This idea that you're going to perform your art for an audience, right?
Like Bolognese.
That. Go ahead.
Yeah, the Bolognese, full of that stuff. Like they, look at Manciulino's tournament rules. He's like 2 points for hitting the foot, not because it's martially sound, but because it's hard, and things like that. Or like the Assaulti, which is designed to be beautiful and wide. And he says this wide play is for show and for sporting. And then when the rubber meets the road, you go to the strata play. You're relatively conservative in your actions, but when you're doing demos, you do it wide. And in my personal practice, I like to do that stuff in tournaments as well. Like, even though, we think of tournaments as a super martial thing, no, tournaments, this is going to be my vain side coming out, are for me to look beautiful and to show my art and to honor those masters who wrote this book for me and said, this stuff is important. It would be dishonoring them. This is where I get mystical. It would be dishonoring their legacy, that sort of spiritual teacher I have through the books, to suddenly be like, nah, I didn't know anything. It's all about the deadly street sword fights. No, I think that when they say stuff like, hey, if you've got a Spiedo, you jump gallantly into the middle of the ring to show you have no fear. And you give the first blow to show that you're fearless. Those things, are important to me in my practice.
It's about efficacy, Ryan. Those things make you better at killing for self-defense in the street when shit hits the fan.
For some reason, hitting your buckler to impress women and scare fellow teenage boys is really going to
enhance your fencing in a real test of your interpretations of the efficacy of your technique.
100%.
Right. Go ahead. Come on, let's hear it. Go. I'm looking at you, not Ryan.
You know what? Listen, I'm here for everyone to be more beautiful. Like that's it. I think, isn't it Roland Versica that says this? That if if you don't look sexy when you're doing it, it's probably interpreted wrong.
I think that martial movement is inherently beautiful if done well. If it's like
Yeah.
martially aligned, if someone's throwing like a good Muay Thai round kick and it's well executed, like everything comes together, it should be beautiful. And I've always been big on that there should be aesthetics, and there's a limit on that. Like the Anonymous Bolognese and like old-timey misogynistic terms, he talks about like you don't want your footwork to look too much like a dance hall. He says it's no place for, he says, the lascivious kicks of a woman, which I don't know what that would mean in his context. Like it's probably Galliard or similar kicky dances. But he's like, you do want to be rooted and
the
measured.
men had to jump, but you do recognize that the men had to actually that may be what it is, right? So the men had like these very powerful, very explosive, and very wide actions like kicks and things like that, whereas maybe the women's weren't, maybe they didn't have as much power.
I don't know, like, so there's a limit on like what they say, be beautiful, but they're also still like, be beautiful. This is something I've written about a few times and talked about, because like the Anonymous, he gives, we have the Bolognese talking about like, your sprezzatura, you should act like this is nothing to you, that they're cultivated and graceful, carefree. But the Anonymous also says that every blow you throw should scare the hell out of your opponent, and you should make him think he says like, you should make him think that he's a devil come to whisk away his soul.
Yeah.
And I don't think those are contradictory ideas at all. Like you see it in Japanese swordsmanship, where like, this is nothing to me, and also I have so much bloodlust in every shot I throw. The aesthetic I sometimes use to sell this to people who are more modern is like, think cool anime villains, right? They tend to be like, beautiful and cool and things like that, but they're like got this bloodthirstiness behind them. That's kind of the idea you should have in addition to your grace and beauty when you're fencing in a more harder for real situation, I think.
Well, I mean, right? Like, I mean, we talk about and think about all the time in the context of real fights, right? Real fights, to the limits of my knowledge on said subject, right? But a lot of it happens in the interplay between the people before blows are thrown. You can overawe someone and win the fight without ever having walked in the ring, right? People attribute a lot more skill to me with a sword than I have. And it's funny, and I'll exploit that shit, right? But like, I'm like, y'all are better than me, but if you don't believe it, I guess I'll hit you.
Well, right. And at what point is it? Yeah, exactly. At what point, at what point are they actually better than you, right? Like,
I mean, I guess, right?
Like, how do you, how do you measure it? How do you measure it? And I think, we've wanted, so we have such a fetish for this idea that we could measure it in terms of point values ascribed to particular discrete and concrete things that aren't either of those, that never end up being either of those.
Right.
Yeah,
right?
there are many fencers who are better than me who I've beaten based on these sort of things I cannot describe. Japanese martial arts and the living tradition kind of has ideas for these things like seme and things that are a little harder to put your finger on, but because when I talk about pressure in that sense, people think of like, oh, it's something physical I'm doing with my sword or anything. It's like, no, it's without getting too like woo-woo esoteric about it, there's a spiritual way I'm pushing you. Like when I come on guard and I move in a certain way, I know like you could tell in the ring who's like the predator and who's the prey almost just by the force between.
Oh, for sure. I mean, we have it. Yeah, we have it in all sorts of like sports psychologists have been analyzing this forever, right? Like just like what it means to be on tilt, right?
Yeah.
Like it's it can and it should be more esoteric than that. Like we shouldn't just say, oh yeah, the sports scientists have figured. We should embrace the esotericism, right?
I mean, we don't have to make it esoteric. Like it can be like it's cross mammalian, right, James? Because we've done this with horses,
right?
And we watch horses do it to cows, right? So,
sure.
I mean, this isn't. I mean, me and my soul am perfectly happy to make it about like my literal soul. But like that doesn't have to be for you. You can just make it about being a mammal if that's what you want.
Or just what physically happens, right? Like
yeah, that's sort of, what construct works for you. Like creating constructs, mental constructs, is part of this whole thing. Like creating this sort of like create your magic almost. Like create things like that, like your framework. But yeah, whether it's sort of that cross mammalian thing or some spiritual.
I was talking with my good friend Bob, who's a medieval philosopher by trade, and we were talking. I was talking about just various metaphors that they would have used, or frameworks that they would have used historically versus ways that we like to think about them today. And just like it seems to me that there have been moments in my life where the more appropriate metaphor was the one that was more easily deconstructed, like earlier, right? And yet it would have been the appropriate way for me to conceive of this thing that I was contending with in that moment, right? Like, so, and it's not to say that the other one, right, the one that's like more scientific or whatever, couldn't be deconstructed, right? Like, because of course it could, right? You just have to like dig a little deeper, and you have to like find where the assumptions are and stuff, and how it breaks down. But like, if they're all metaphors anyway, and like maybe it's more appropriate to think of these things in like this mystical sort of way or whatever, and if it gets you there, and it just seemed to me in that moment that like I was happy to say like, yeah, for humors or whatever, right? Like fine, like
great.
Like it works.
I'm pretty sanguine. It's fine.
I'm very very choleric and sanguine, so like it's these metaphors, they work, they just work. And there's a difference between the hammer you use every day, and like maybe it's not the state of the art hammer, maybe it's not like the best, like most scientifically designed hammer, but if there's the hammer you got and it's working for all your day-to-day tasks, there's nothing really, I think, wrong with that.
That's actually
it's just
really good. Speaking of metaphors, that's excellent.
Maybe at some point, like you have different nails or whatever, like I'm stretching the metaphor too much here, it's gonna collapse in on itself.
No, but that's it, right? So like maybe you're
gonna need to change hammers at some point. You're gonna have to get a better hammer.
And maybe not a better hammer per se, but like a better
more
hammer
fitting
for that
hammer.
job.
Or more fitting hammer.
Expand the tools that you have, right? So like they're all tools. We're not going to arrive at some ultimate objective thing. They're all just tools. And the more phenomena that we have to contend with, the more limited what we have to work with is, and the more we have to kind of expand that so that we're able to contend with more, right? So like so it's never a case of like, no, that was wrong. And in fact, this is like when I see interpretations that I don't agree with, I used to approach it, and this is historical fencing interpretations or whatever, I used to approach it as like, that's not right, you should interpret it this way, right? Like this is the correct, more robust, more appropriate, more that accounts for more things way of dealing with the thing. But I've since after like adopting this more I don't know, the worldview that I've sort of adopted, I've been less interested in whether or not their approach is quote unquote wrong, and more interested in what questions is their approach answering for them effectively.
I like that. I like that a lot, especially because I think there's a tendency to, depending on people's martial backgrounds, to treat HEMA like a Koryu, like that I'm trying to preserve this living lineage as literally and accurately as I can. We don't have the initiatory structure of a Koryu or anything like that. Most people don't know what a Koryu is, but they try to treat it like one sometimes. And as somebody who, so this is going to sound weird to a lot of people, I assume, but like, there's part of me that preserves the assaultee as best I can. It's like, I want to encapsulate the meaning as best I can in isolation. Like, how does this work in the circumstances that they may have thought of? Even though that's an impossible task, there's that. But there's also...
It's an excellent tool. It's an excellent meditative tool.
But then there's also, the meditative aspect. But then I also have this sort of living aspect to my HEMA. where I want to go out and I want to fight Filipino martial arts practitioners. I want to go to lightsaber tournaments. I want to go into LARPs. And I've written about this before, where if I can use my art and its tools and its mindset to defeat somebody who could hurl lightning bolt beanbags at me, and I could also win in HEMA, and I can also win this, doesn't that mean that my art, as I practice it, is more robust and better, and probably what wouldn't the masters have been like, yeah, that guy wins a lot with our ideas, or would they, I can't speak for them, but I think there's a mixture of both, and I think that there's a good living aspect to HEMA that you can cultivate in that regard.
Absolutely. I mean, I had a gentleman coming and training with me last weekend, and he's in the Army, and he does, I don't know, Army things that involve putting enemy soldiers into pain compliance until they tell him things. So, like, he asked me as a Furist about Leichenauer. And so I was like, well, let me tell you about these 12 words over here, right? And I just give him a quick rundown of the principles of the art in the way that I understand it. And he's like, yeah, this feels like work to me. Like, this feels like all of the things I do at work. And I was like, yeah, great. I understand what we're talking about then. It's just swords, man.
Yeah. It's just swords. It's just this, and you can just keep applying them in like all contexts. If you're like, coming from a Lichtenauer background, you see this like if you're touching in some kind of bridge, to use a kung fu aphorism for it, or a bind. The moment somebody gives you space or pulls back, you onzets, you rush in there and you follow them in. And that's a universal idea. It's a good idea.
Yeah, right.
It's a really good idea.
Certainly in terms of this game, right? Like, certainly in terms of this game of combat is defined by, whatever, like whether it be the swords and the touch, or if it be like just controlling space, or like pushing your opponent back, right? Like in a, whatever, and on a battlefield, right? Like if the enemy has to pull back to reinforce themselves, whatever, like, you don't just like, oh, look, they're no, you have to take that moment to rush in to close that space so that they can't like come back and retake it. Right. That's pretty great. That's actually really great. Okay, so I wanted to talk about one more thing. So Jesse, you I think we spent a little bit of time talking about this already, but you shared this with me when I was like, this is several years ago now, I was like on a pro wrestling kick, you recall.
Yes.
And yes, this is true. This is a real thing that actually happened. So, but you shared with me your pro wrestling experience, right?
Well, I don't really have pro wrestling experience.
No, you
but
don't.
I do have
not in those terms, right? But but there are several dimensions where there's a tremendous amount of overlap.
Yeah, I mean,
even in terms of its history, like your sort of like very short history and the very long history of pro wrestling, right?
Well, I mean, I'm guessing you're going where I used to fight on stage with swords.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. So, like, that's how I got my start in swords, right? But I don't know if you know this story, Ryan, at all.
I don't.
Oh, sweet. So, but yeah, so I got my start in swords on stage in the 90s at Renaissance festivals. And HEMA didn't, it existed, but it didn't exist, right?
Yeah.
And so we were like doing swords competitively-ish for entertainment value, right? So basically professional wrestling, right?
Yeah.
And
but that wasn't exactly the way that you were thinking about it then, right? So like you and your cohort wanted to do something different.
Oh, no, I mean, initially we thought we were fighting with swords. Like, we recognized there was like, well, we're not thrusting, we're not hitting each other in the head, but like, we'll hit anything else. And we were just wearing like clothes. Right? Like goofy clothes, but just clothes, and like deerskin work gloves, right? And we're on stage. And so, but due to the nature of the thing, you're working for tips. So the audience has to be excited if you're going to get paid, right? And so due to the nature of the thing that is swords, we all know it's real easy to clip somebody's hand on the way in. Real easy.
Yeah.
Also really boring. Nobody in the audience gives a shit that you hit somebody's hand, right? So, and it sucks getting hit in the hands all the time. Real bad.
Right.
So, like, we started doing things of like, oh, on your way in, turn the flat, pop them with the flat, because it hurt less, and we can do 6 shows a day. Cool, right? And then we start doing like, oh, well, let's get rid of anything below the elbow, because actually forearms suck too. So let's get rid of those. And like, oh, a couple of us got shin, like, you know, you work somebody up high and pop their shin like you do in, you know, I don't know, single stick or sword and buckler or whatever, right? We all learned all of these games against each other, right? It sucks getting popped in the shin, especially if you're wearing a kilt, right? That's a bad day, you know? And so we got rid of anything below the knee because it sucked. And like all of a sudden we have developed basically fucking Myers rules for effectula.
Yeah.
Because
that's really cool.
Yeah. And like this was before we knew that existed. It just developed organically over time from our competing desires to get the most tips and to be the least injured.
Yeah.
Well, but also your interest, at least initially, of preserving the integrity, such as you understood it, of what you were doing, right?
Oh yeah,
which is like this idea that like we're fighting with swords. This is a competition. We're being competitive, right?
Yes.
But then didn't you turn in? But then didn't And so you started as like you started shooting, but didn't it turn into a work, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, it did.
So explain that.
Because eventually it got to be like. Well, eventually we all developed with whoever we were with, and we did have characters that were, you know, heels or faces or, you know, these archetypes. But you would develop a pattern that you could fall into, and then there's this like broken rhythm moment that you could steal, and it became like, how fucking fast can we go, right? In this rhythm, we know, attacking these openings that we know, and then break it and surprise the other partner. And then it starts building like, oh, we have reached the limits of our capability to do that faster and faster and faster. Now it has to get showier. Okay, every now and then I'm gonna throw a I don't know. I'm gonna pop up into like a half sword sort of ox thing, and you know a Mordschlag's coming. Because the moment you see me do that, you know I'm coming.
We got high spots, Ryan.
Right. Yeah. And so, okay, so you know that's coming. So you cover that, and then I get to kick your stomach, and you're going to take a big backfall because you're a bad guy, and I'm a woman and default a good guy because sexism exists. So, like, we're going to do that, and then all of a sudden, everybody loses their fucking minds in the audience, right?
This is 100% like, you know, you look at like 18th century stage gladiators, which, you know, the school I train out currently is a broadsword school, mainly focused on regimental broadsword. But the broadsword stuff I like is all stage gladiator cool stuff because it's just pro wrestling. Because these guys are fighting with sharps. People did die, but most of the time these guys just had scars and things like that. They weren't trying to kill each other. They're trying to draw blood, look cool. Even Roman gladiators, like the amount of people who died in those does not suggest they were fought that often to the death all the time. People think, oh, this is the real blood sport, the real to the death thing. But no, it's the same pro wrestling stuff. They even had stuff in old Roman gladiator stuff. It's like, this guy's dressed like a foreigner, and he's like, boo, Rome sucks. And they're like, hey, that guy hates us, boo. Yeah. You know, the same stuff you do in pro wrestling today. I'm Johnny Foreigner, I hate America. But now it's like, you know, I hate Romans, or I hate, it's that instant heat. Like, Eric Lowe, as you guys may know, is like me, a fancy lad, or I like him a fancy lad. So I guess he's older than me. But you know, that elegant Bolognese thing where we have the cloaks and fence fancy, and we do events where we're fighting against people who do Viking combat or wear kilts or whatever. instant nuclear heat because people want to be like the cool barbarian guys. So they're like, yeah, they like see us with our frippery and they're like, boo. So it's the same dynamic, and I love it.
It's really cool. And what's so interesting to me is that, like, you know, as she's telling me this story, I'm just like, all I'm doing is like reframing it using the like pro wrestling terminology and vernacular, and like and just hearing her give me the history of pro wrestling, right? Mm-hmm. Like how it starts as like, you know, this competitive thing and it slowly turns into a work for, you know, a variety of reasons, for protection so that you can continue to do it over and over and over again, to like getting the heat so that you can get the audience involved, to now all of a sudden you've got these archetypes this story that you're telling in the demonstration. And it's everything all the way up to like, you've got high spots and you've got scripted finishes, and but you have unchoreographed and unscripted like works, right? So like there's a whole culture of professional wrestling of like, and again, this is kind of diminished now, but when professional wrestling didn't exist as an industry the way that it does today, but rather it existed as sort of a culture that transcended that, right? Like there were these pockets all over the country of people who just learned how to do this thing, and they would be able to work with each other. They would be able to just like see each other and immediately fall into a rhythm or fall into line, because they could assess what the other person was capable of, and they could put on a show. They just knew how to work. There was an art. It was an art, right? Yeah. It's less of an art now, right? And not to say that it's not artful what people are doing, right? It's very skillful what people are doing, but the art, the way that I am always kind of going back to how I define art, right, which is the idea of this creative expression, a human creativity and imagination in moments, right, like where you're choosing based on things that are happening, right? And you still do see that every once in a while, right? But like historically, the wrestlers were sensitive to each other. They were sensitive to the needs of the crowd. Mm-hmm. Right. So like you would know what kind of spot you were going to run in your match based on where the heat was, or based on how bought in the audience was. Like if it's just, you know, if people were already giving up on you, then the artful answer might have been, let's fucking get this match over with. Like let's just go home. You know what I mean?
Oh yeah. No, I mean, and our shows were very much like that. It was all improv-ish, and it was all based on the mood, right? And there were shows that like nobody wanted to end, and there were fights that like the first exchange you were just like, this is gonna be rough. we can't end this. Nobody can end this fast enough, right? And it has nothing to do with anything but like the ambient energy of like
that's
whatever.
Exactly. It's pro wrestling, like, you know, most people called spots on the fly. You just like usually heels call matches and they do it on the fly. Like there's exceptions, of course, great exceptions. Like Macho Man Randy Savage wanted everything laid out. Apparently, according to a lot of people, he wanted it all. Everything was scripted for him. But he was a great wrestler. But most of the people just called it on the fly. They just called spots.
Right. Yeah, and they allowed for that because they were able to feed off that energy. And I want to go back to a couple things. So number one, this idea that there is that in our martial practice, however you want to define what you do, or martial or solar, like whatever your fancy is, right? That in this thing that we do, that if we're interested in completeness or robustness, right, then shouldn't we think about that aspect of our practice, right? Like the relational in terms of an audience, or the story that we're telling, and how it engages culture or society, community, audience members, people watching what's happening, right? That's a whole thing that like that I think most of us don't want to believe in, or maybe I don't want to speak for anyone here, but like I've seen that some, like a lot of people don't care for this, or don't sort of, but then like, but does it make you a better fencer? Like, how do we want to identify as being, you know, we are making decisions about what it means to do our thing and do it well. Right? We've all decided that we want to do what we do well, right? And so we have to start with assumptions. And so, like, are we allowed to say that me being able to perform a dance in front of the audience is an aspect of my practice that I find important enough to develop and cultivate and become better at, right? And like, and it's not dissimilar. Again, going back to Daman and these various African arts, and it's not just African arts, right? It's like, it's everywhere. And it was us here too in the West. We also had this. Like, you look at old 1890s or 1880s pictures of German or French fencing saws, and like, you see those, like, or just in pubs or bars, right? The pugilists, right? You see like the crowds of people, you know, and it was a community thing, right? And we don't have that. We don't want to think about that. And it was you, we did talk about this because you said, Jesse, that it was World War I ruined everything.
I think World War I did ruin everything, but but what I was gonna say is, like, you can choose to believe it or not, but when you are fencing at a modern HEMA tournament, you are performing for the crowd of judges. And if you think that's not real, you're probably not getting everything you think should be called for you.
Yeah, there's the practical element of that. Like, you know, you are always performing for the judges. And like, even when people talk about like, well, if you don't get your judges well, make your actions cleaner. Well, it's like, well, if we're really talking to ourselves about how martial everything is, doesn't matter how cleanly I've shanked somebody. It really doesn't. But you know, by the very action to be like,
that's a great point. That's a great point.
That's exactly it.
The moment
clean exits your mouth, there's a performative element to it.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. Totally. It doesn't matter. Like, I'm unscathed and he is shanked. That's the quote unquote reality of the thing. And it doesn't matter what it looked like or what happened, right? It doesn't matter that none of you could see, right? The reality is that. But of course, that's not what anyone wants, including all of these people on their own terms.
Master Godinho, he's specifically, like I said, he has rules for sporting and, like, you know, who you're supposed to fence sportingly, had like demos, but he also has stuff where it's like, hey, if this guy's better than you at fencing, backhand him, keep him from drawing his sword, and then knife him, which is not what people want to see, but it's like, clearly there's a room for this guy who is the streetiest of the street violence guys in Renaissance HEMA to be like, but also you should be beautiful in times where you're not, you know, outnumbered in a back alley in Lisbon.
Right.
Yeah. We're talking about someone came up with this there was a new just video cam, like using video footage, like sort of, you know, when you're watching the Super Bowl or whatever, and there's ambiguity in terms of what happened, and so they have to like do the thing where the camera like gets the 360-degree view and you get to see the football and the person from every angle and whether or not his knee touched first. Or in baseball they do it too now, like, was the ball in the glove, is it outside the glove, was his foot on the bag, let's see frame by frame. And I just remember I was chatting with some folks about it, and you know, Rob Rutherford, who's never one to couch his feelings or opinions in nuance, was like, yeah, if I don't what did he say? I think he said, if I need a camera to tell me what happened in an exchange, it wasn't good enough. Like, you don't get it. You don't get the point. Like, if I need to, you know, which is, and he's just open about it, right? Or at least he's being honest with himself about it, right? Like,
and I like, you know, you already know my opinion. I lean into the fact that, you know, you should be performing, and I think it's a little easier sometimes when, like, you know, because fewer tournaments do stuff like put Albions on the line as prizes, which at that point it becomes to the death. Everyone's, you know, I want there's kind of that element to it.
That's so true. That's so true.
People will, like, swords change people, man. But I enjoy the performance aspect of it. Like, I Like I
Or
don't
just
play
the medal,
SCA much.
yeah. Like
Yeah.
just the fact that you get the medal, or you get to post,
Yeah.
like they post the results of the tournament
Yeah,
online.
and one of the things I liked when playing the SCA is I could like do gallant chivalry stuff and like like salute a lady, receive a favor. I live for that kind of thing, and I think it's
Mhm.
important. They viewed it as important, but we're like we hold these masters up on a pedestal. A lot of us are like in their word and things like that, like, oh, these are the techniques. But when they say, hey, you should throw the first shot so people don't think you're a coward, people are like, that part's not important. And it's like,
Right.
no, it was like honor was everything to them. Imagine if being called like, an asshole ruined your credit score. That's what it basically is.
Yeah.
Mm.
Yeah. It's true.
Yeah.
James is having thoughts.
Well, no, it's just that's its own podcast, right? Like,
Yeah.
like just the whole question of honor, cultural masculinity, and its relationship
Mhm.
with these type of conflict resolution schemes, right?
Yeah.
Which is,
Mhm.
which can be, and it can be what we're doing here. It can be a version of, like, what we are doing here can be a version of this sort of conflict resolution scheme, right?
Mhm.
But it also, as we've been saying this entire time, it also is very often something else entirely, which is interesting. And so, like, okay, so so I do want to take a little bit of time and talk a little bit more about tradition, right? So, like,
Yeah.
Ryan, you have a lot of you have so much experience, and you've already kind of betrayed yourself, which is to say that, like, you are interested in cultivating something within yourself, right? Like, and these practices, or your knowledge of various systems or various expressions of whatever combat, sport, or martial art, or whatever, are ways in which you enhance your own life,
Mhm.
right? To solve problems for you today,
Yes.
right? And it seems like you're less interested maybe in the ossification, or the sort of like the Koryu like approach, like we're trying to preserve, so tell me more about how you came to that choice, and tell me more about, because you have so much experience outside of HEMA, and how do you integrate your, like, what is it that you do, right? How do you identify or define yourself?
So I've loved martial arts my whole life. I started at 5 years old, the way most Americans start, with Taekwondo. And from a young age, I was
Which is
proud to be a Taekwondo.
that's probably true, right? Like, I guess
Yeah.
I never really thought about it, but I think that's probably, how
Oh
did that
yeah.
happen? Why
Uh,
Taekwondo?
Partially because like the Korean diaspora did a really good job of pushing like Taekwondo as an Olympic sport and like really being a good proselytization movement for Taekwondo. Karate was kind of more ad hoc. Karate was various schools, usually of U.S. servicemen coming over from what they learned in Okinawa after the war. So you had Ishinryu, you had Shorinryu, you had Goju, all these organizations. Not really a central organizing body, not really a larger sporting paradigm like Judo had when it had come over. Taekwondo from the get-go was well, not from the get-go, because there's a whole lot of unification process that happened. But by the time it came over to the US, was a mostly unified thing. Like ITF Taekwondo was still here, and the World Taekwondo Kukiwan was here, but it was still Taekwondo. And sometimes they'd hold themselves out as like Korean karate and things like that, because more people knew what karate was. But there was just sort of that bigger push, I think, from a sporting perspective and that unified organization perspective. And I think that's kind of responsible for it. But I from the get go, did Taekwondo, and I was taught to be proud to be a Taekwondo practitioner. Like, there was this show that came on in the '90s, which a lot of us martial arts weirdo kids watched, called WMAC Masters, that was hosted by Shannon Lee, and it had like these things it was billed as like a martial arts competition, but it was like a scripted show that was fun where they fought ninjas and stuff. It talked about martial arts virtues and morality. But Olympus was my favorite because he was a Taekwondo guy. But I wrestled, I did karate. A lot of my big studies besides HEMA recently, and I've dabbled in a lot of things. I've done some capoeira, I've done some of those because I just love the buffet. My big focus besides HEMA though recently has been Pak Mei Kung Fu, which is a southern short fist style that I've been learning with Russ Smith. Has been quite fun, and also I've been wanting to do Savate my whole life, and then I finally got to do Savate at a seminar, and I'm like a diehard Savate man now, and I just do
Love
so much.
it.
Love Savate, but that's sort of like my martial arts background in general. Like I said, I've dabbled a lot of things, but besides HEMA, my big focus right now is just Kung Fu and Savate, and training
So what?
a lot.
So tell me how it is that you escaped the sort of the perspective that we've all been condemned to here, which is to say, like anything that you like, any way that you deviate from this very particular way of approaching pedagogy and martial arts system, and like you have to be 100% vital to this particular set of or whatever, because that's what HEMA is. It doesn't count as HEMA if you're not doing this. And like you have managed to avoid the baggage of not allowing yourself to integrate that thing that you get from HEMA into a broader sense of who you are.
Yeah, and I think that partially comes from I really genuinely love ritual and religion and tradition. Like I myself am religious, but you don't really have to be to approach kind of this role of ritual and ritual space and putting on various masks and like your systems and things like that in a metaphorical way. It's kind of hard to put this. It's like when Mircea Eliade and people talk about like myth, right? Like myth is to impart a hierarchy of the sacred to someone else that you can't quite explain. But I don't have a really good myth to impart this to people yet. But you've given me a reason to think of one now. But it's this, but it's this idea that when I am doing the thing, and I'm not doing a Koryu, even though I love Koryu and things like that, what is important to me in the tradition, and I learned this from a combination of teachers, yes, perspectives and things like that. I had a really good like karate teacher, and she was, Japanese and very traditional, but at the same time was also like always looking at other places for ideas like Western fencing and so on. But it's sort of when I do the art, what does it mean to be doing the art? What does it mean to be practicing the tradition? And for a lot of people, that means I am either wanting to recreate something that's dead. I'm wanting to do it as the masters ostensibly taught, or at least try to get close to it. And I'm excluding, for purposes of the conversation, I want to swing swords around people because that's fun and cool too. And it's just as valid as my approach or any other approach, but it's just not something that's my approach. But for me, doing the art it's essentially, an art is almost like a virus. It wants to just propagate itself. It wants to keep existing. And in the case of like the HEMA virus, it's like frozen in ice, and we can't really get to it anymore and things like that. But to propagate that thing, again, this is so hard to find good words for. It's not so much the recreation of the ossified form, which is almost impossible. It's the taking that tradition that was given by the masters, and applying it to things that exist today.
Mm-hmm.
And it is somehow, again, I can't speak for the masters, but it just doesn't seem honoring as much to their memory. And again, I get very reverential and weird and mystical about the masters. I'll try not to for this conversation, so people don't watch this later and be like, man, that guy's way too weird. But I want Morozzo and Manciolino and those people to be like, man, that guy can beat practitioners we didn't even fathom, like Japanese sword art practitioners. He's like learning with them and showing his principles. Yeah. He's going to people who, like FMA is really big among, like when schools have mixed programs, FMA is usually where they get their weapons from, which is great. Yeah. Filipino martial arts are fantastic. I love them. But I also like to go to the schools and be like, the Renaissance Europe has more answers than you think it might have. I know that the weapons seem archaic, but the ideas are universal. When I teach unarmed striking, I teach the Bolognese 5 tempi. Mm-hmm. Like the ideas of when you should hit somebody. And I think that is more honoring to their memory, as opposed to like, if I brought Morozzo in a time machine and after his being confused about like women's suffrage or suffrage in general and all those other things, I think he would be, a little baffled if it's like, well, you don't have duels anymore. Why are you preparing for them?
Yeah.
Those kind of things. It's like, well, I preserve that aspect of your art. I also apply it to things that are going on now. And I think that there's nothing wrong with that. And some people will crucify me for this, I know, but that's my view. Sorry that was kind of rambly and weird and kind of over the place, but it's hard to really phrase this idea in words. And I need to really think about it.
Well, you as you were talking, I was thinking, having just a moment, like bringing Marazzo into the future, whoever, right? Ringek or whatever, and just like two Hemaists, right? Like come up to Ringek and like and like one Hemaist is like, this is what I do with your art, right? And like proceeds to play a bunch of video games or like or a board game or just drive to work, or like this is how I apply your art to this business, this conflict in like a business negotiation or whatever, right? And then like the other guy who's just like a total sycophant, and he's like, look, so this is what you mean. So I figured out what you mean, right? Like, so this is how you do it. Like, this is the perfect way, right? Whatever the technique is or whatever. Like, and who would just like Ringek would be like, all right, this is great. Good job, buddy. Like, and then he would like quickly go talk to the other person. Like, I want to sit here and learn more. I always
like that the Bolognese has given me that idea of really sprezzatura, that idea of how I should carry myself in the fencing, to be gallant, to be polished, to be polite, to be a little flashy, a little flirty. There's kind of that flirtation element to it as well, like in fencing and fighting. Like Hema in Pajamas is going to run with that one, but like it's that idea that like how you should carry yourself throughout your life and loving, like live, laugh, loving, like poster energy. That I think that those principles do exist in HEMA. It is not just the external practices of art. You can apply it to martial arts. You can apply it to everything. And I think genuinely HEMA has made me a better person, as cheesy as that sounds. And it's because of those kind of things that, like, I'm not going to do the whole spiel about it because I get weepy every time I do it. It's cheesy. But like whenever I talk about,
hear it. I don't know why we do not do it. Please do it.
Stoicism, stoic, not in the philosopher sense, but in the colloquial sense. But the like Master Godinho, for example, his book was never published. It was never published, as far as we can tell. It's his handwritten notes. It's full of typos. It's full of marginalia. Him crossing out like, talk about this topic next and things like that. And that book survived. And he died probably without ever knowing that, some boxy-headed, chubby Irish dude in America someday would pick this book up and like as translated by Tim Rivera and, fall in love with that text and that tradition and be like, I can't, and I'm so grateful that it survived and that he left this for me. He didn't leave it, with me in mind, but he left this for me. If you guys are kind of weirdos too, so you gotta get what I'm saying.
No, I'm with you.
Yeah. And I get a little teary-eyed when I talk about this at the end of Godinho seminars, and I've cried once before because I just like it, the emotional impact of it gets to me. Same with the Bolognese stuff is obviously mass-produced. People quoted Morozzo forever, but it's the same idea. It's like they left this for me. Like Morozzo wrote this for his son if he followed him in his trade, and it was mass-published. And like that legacy means so much to me that I think it actually physically hurts me inside to just do the actions from it, as opposed to figure out like, what are they trying to teach me besides that?
Yeah.
And some of it's archaic morality and things like that we have evolved beyond, like, hey, if a guy insults you, roll up with 6 of your friends and knife him. But there's also good, beautiful lessons too that I think are in fact timeless. And that's my moral realist kind of roots showing, but yeah.
Yeah.
Sure. And like, I might not go as far as to say timeless, but certainly there are ways in which what we're getting, because we're not getting what is in Marazzo's mind Marozzo's mind, right, when he's
Mhm.
writing his text, is not coming out through the text, and it's not.
Correct.
I'm not just going to be able to like inject it into my psyche and understand it like that, right? But it is a thing that I can take and use and learn from and apply in my life, like what I've learned or the way I've interacted with it, right?
Mhm.
I
I
can
agree.
take the lessons that I've learned from those things and apply them in my real world. And like I do think that there's something to be said about like like I'm actually going to use this perspective explicitly, I think, from now on. It was like I want these people to like me, like
Yes.
Yeah.
and like and there's a way in which we all always want everyone to like us, right?
Mhm.
Yeah.
And there's also like various approaches that we can take in terms of like I want these people to like me because of who I am, not I want them to like me because what I look like to them, right? So like so for me, I do want these people to like me, but because they see me for who I am and they like that person, right?
Mhm.
And I think about like how could I achieve that? And I think the best way to achieve it is to understand something about what they're saying in a deep and profound way, right? And it can only be deep and profound if it's something that I can integrate into my picture, like my personal picture, right? Like
Yes.
that's what deep and profound understanding is. It's when you take the thing and you integrate it into the rest of what you have, right?
Mhm.
Because that's all you can do, right? But I would never. It seems very performative otherwise, right? To say like this is what
Yes.
this is what the masters were, this is what they were really saying, and it's as though we're like looking to take this opportunity to if we could ever find the master and like I figured it out, Ringek. This is what a Duplaren looks like,
Mhm.
and like and I can't imagine any world where like Ringek would be like, I really like you.
Yeah. This like people tend to not write long books about things they hate as a general rule, at least in the martial arts world. And it's again, this is going to sound cheesy, but this is a more emotionally vulnerable podcast than I was expecting. But it's having the art in your heart in a way, in kind of a cheesy way. Like this art is in my heart. It's in my soul. It's why when people tell me, man, you're really enthusiastic about this, or like, you're always trying to come up with new ideas to express it in different ways. Like, how do you express it in this kind of fight context? Some of you may like I posted about this on my wall once, like the teacup metaphor. It's like if you really understand the art, you should be able to fight with a teacup.
Yep.
You should be able to express it with a teacup, and if you can't, then you don't really know it. And like if the art is in your heart, it just comes out. And again, that will sound cheesy, and people will like hate it, but it's true. This is why I love the art. It is genuinely in my heart, and I try to express it in my being as best I can.
Yeah.
Love it.
Jesse, you had thoughts on the teacup metaphor. I give you the
Did
floor.
I?
Yeah, you did.
I don't remember them now. They're
Oh,
long
no.
gone. You know why? Because Ryan said something about a live, laugh, love poster, and now I want in that script Vornok Indes to put up in my training hall.
I love it. I love it.
So that really cleared my brain of all other thoughts, frankly.
That's fair. but yeah, it's the idea that the art is in your heart and it suffuses you. And I think people give up too easily on it in HEMA, or like they never wanted it. So they either never wanted it and they always wanted to reconstruct the techniques as best they done, or they kind of give up. It's like, well, it's not a living tradition. We can't have these things like that we would with a living tradition, which, to be fair, a lot of living traditions kind of have lost that more than people think they do, or it's expressed differently. And I think that people, you see this more like this Budo idea and like, modern Japanese Budo, where it's like, oh, it makes you a better person. It's a do, it's a way of life. It suffuses you, things like that. But at HEMA, everyone basically, like a lot of people are like, nah, you can't really have that in HEMA. That's not what it's for. Or that's too mystical. We're diehard practical, whatever.
Yeah, I mean, that's not my jam. I mean,
not my jam at all.
Yeah. No, I believe strongly in wide-ranging application of this study. You know, I wouldn't have it any other way for myself, but you know, I'm with you. Like you can just roll up because swords are cool, and that's like there's enough room in
100%.
this. There's enough room in this training space for all of us, right? And but it does. You know what? I'm with you, Ryan, in that, and I think you're expressing this a little bit. I carry some sadness for the people who would like this, who don't understand they could get it through this art, that it does exist.
And I try my best to like convey that. Like initially I was super shy about it because, you know, when you're new to HEMA and things like that, there are, you know, there's people who, you know, will genuinely talk down to you, who are good practitioners in general, but will, you know, there's a lot of people who like have gone in full like eat their yun mindset, because I get it, we get burned out on seeing the same question every week and things like that. But at the same time, there's a lot of like, you know, I've been doing this for 20 years, blah blah blah. When it's like, man, I've seen videos of HEMA from 20 years ago, and I'm not sure how much of that counts. I'm kidding. It's like that we were definitely different 20 years ago, at least from what I could see outside looking in. I didn't live during that, but you know, you're very shy initially without expressing those ideas. But as I've gotten more confident about it, I've, you know, had that mix of Morozzo, you know, when he was teaching students and like things like that, or Darty was teaching students, it's like, hey, you want to learn sword and buckler, it's this lot of a course, it's this much money. Which is, you know, there's room for those people. It's like, I want to learn how to use the longsword. I want to learn the longsword, like that video that went around. And that's fine. That's perfectly fine. But if somebody approached him, it's like, I want to be a master of this art. I don't think the approach does not seem to have been $20 and it's a X week course. That's like, no, you got to learn all the weapons. You got to learn the whole thing. That's a different demand.
It's so it's funny you're talking about like seeing the same questions. My mindset has changed so much recently. I can't remember it if it, you know, it was probably a month ago or so. Somebody posted in on the interwebs somewhere. They're talking about they're joining HEMA, or they sort of joined into the HEMA community with this particular goal in mind, and this like sense of what HEMA should be and the way that we should integrate it with other more quote unquote practical, like, you know, what if someone kicks you in the balls or something, like it was that kind of thing. And and like there was a time where I would have like, I'm sure I probably don't want to admit it, but I'm sure there was a time where I would have been like, yeah, right. Although I can't remember that time, so maybe I'm just not giving myself enough credit. Anyway, but there was definitely a time where I would have like hard rolled my eyes. Right, I would have been like, God, here we go with this, right?
Yeah, I was like, there. Like, there's that especially when you're like that green brown belt HEMA level where it's like, that's either you've done this a very long time, or you've done this like you're the green brown level where it's like, I'm 100% sure about what is and is not historical or important.
Yes.
Well, and so like, yeah, but then like when I saw this post like a month ago, and I like checked, I predicted, I well anticipated the comments, you know, that he was going to get totally blown up by everyone who's been around for 6 months to a year and a half or whatever. Like, that's not the way. And I was just like, you know what, man, I'm fucking here for you, bro. Like, let's go. Yeah. Like, let's do it. Like, let's do like a tournament where we're like, we're not wearing masks, and we can kick each other in the balls or whatever. Like, why not? Right? What, you know, like at least you're trying. You know what I'm saying? At least you're trying something, right?
This was a conversation I kind of had. One of the weird conversations and one of the weird Facebook groups I'm in about this, where it's like, you know, someone was like, I don't like tournaments where people have daggers on their belt and fight with longsword, and like, which is, you know, increasingly the reasons like, there's no historical sourcing for this kind of tournament, and there's like lots of great techniques that don't involve the dagger and things like that. And someone said, but it's fun though. And then someone's like, fun is not a reason to do a tournament rule set. I'm like, fun is exactly the reason you do tournament rule set. This is like, look at what these people did. Let's wrestle with one guy on one leg and like, you know, one guy in a dick, because it's funny to watch and it's useful.
Right. Yes.
Fun is
absolutely
100% why we should do these things.
Right.
Like,
And it's
oh,
also
man.
cathartic and therapeutic, right?
Yeah.
Right? Like to reckon, like, hey, let's remind ourselves for a second. Like, let's play this game where someone's only on one foot and then someone's in a hole. And like, let's remind ourselves that none of this should be taken too seriously so that we can get so much more out of this thing.
Right.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
People need to learn to play. And this is a big thing too, where I tell people, like, when I teach people, like, I teach people the canonical technique as interpreted and things like that. And then a lot of practices will either stop there or like, now go free fence and do it. But I encourage people when I teach like privately and things like that, play with it. Like, take this idea and play with this. Like, what if we've got butter dies? How does this get, like, play? Because it's something that, you know, I felt I was even more on the right track because the Savate teacher I did a seminar with, Nicolas Sagnac, incredibly good teacher, really effective, which makes sense because his day job is elementary school teacher. Man can teach, but he's like, he encourages people to play these fun distance games to relax, and he says that the reason you do that is because you're better at stuff when you're relaxed and having fun.
Yep.
If you're constantly like jaw clenched, like, this is for real, man, you're usually not going to be as good.
Yeah.
James and I love play.
Yeah. We've spent so much time. I mean, play is so much bigger too. Like, it's certainly everything that you're saying, but it's also like there's so many more ways. Like, the way that we think about play is like this mental space that you can go where you can experience failure safely, right, without like experiencing the trauma that comes with failure when you fail at something and it actually mattered, right? Like, like, you don't want to fail driving. Right.
Yeah.
But like, if you can come up with
learning to play like that, like, also it influenced my fencing so much for the better in the competitive context, and it also made it showier and more fun, because what I started to play with is like, well, I really want to be even more carefree. That I'm not going to use my sword to defend in sparring. I'm just going to play more with, like, I'm going to use distance. I'm going to bait. I'm going to take things away. I'm going to offer, take away, and play this game in my head, essentially, where like, I'm not going to use my sword to defend. I'm going to just play fun distance games and see how close I can make people miss me and make people go, ooh. But what wound up influencing my fencing, that like, I still, you know, I use the sword to defend when I have to because it's what it's there for. It's the art of defense. But I got so much better at distance and also invitations and like fun little things because of playing this fun game. Because I played the okay to fail space versus the I don't like losing space. And things like that. Yeah,
absolutely. That's freaking brilliant. I think we are nearing time, James.
We are at time. I'm gonna say this. I am gonna come up with something I'm going to introduce to my fencing school probably within the next 2 to 3 classes is going to be like, I'm gonna come in with a jar of ways that you can impose a set of rules on yourself.
Nice.
Right? And you just have to reach into the jar and grab one. Right. And like, that's what you're going to do during free play in that moment. Right. And like,
I love it.
And, you know, and this way, that's really smart, because all you're doing is you're limiting the way in which you're engaging. And what that's doing is it's honing the aspects that you're focusing on through limiting. Right. And like, that's all any of this is like, we're just limiting the domain so that we can gain more fluency or more fidelity of the domain. And then we can expand that as time goes by or whatever, right? But like,
beautiful.
But I think that's really smart. And one of them is going to be in your honor, Ryan. You're not allowed to parry.
Cannot parry. You gotta stunt on people. Like, you know, like the way I teach it. So it's like bolognese is sometimes the art of offering something and then taking it away at the last minute. Like, so if you come like put along a straighta, you offer that shoulder, and then you just take it away from them.
Love it.
Those kind of fun distance games. So I love that idea.
All right, thanks so much, Ryan. It was great to have you, and we're definitely gonna have you on again.
Awesome. Well, I'm glad I earned an invitation back, as opposed to like, you know, like having to go through like an auto defay now for my heresies.
Excellent. Bye, y'all.
Thank you so much for having me.